Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Welcome to the 2024 American Academy of Diplomacy Conference here at Monticello. I'm Andrew Davenport, Acting Saunders Director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies. Before we begin, I'd like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to AAD, Ambassador Ronald Newman and Maria Reisos, and the UVA Center for Politics, Damon Irby and Meg Hubeck, for their partnership over many years. Welcome to all students in attendance, especially students from UVA and the Miller School of Albemarle. And thank you to my Monticello colleagues, including Jane Kamensky, Leslie Bradley, Caitlin Lawrence, and Gay Wilson. Thank you all. You've prepared the way for an enlightening day. The topic of this year's conference is Elections and Diplomacy, Charting a Smooth Course Through Turbulent Electoral Waters. As we all know, and some of us know this a bit more acutely and intimately than others, elections have consequences. As a dual citizen of the US and Ireland, I keep a close eye on elections, both foreign and domestic, always wondering how shifting political sands will affect relations at home and abroad. I look to the diplomats in the room to delve more deeply into how they navigate these currents and ensure good relations between nations. But as a historian at Thomas Jefferson Monticello, it falls to me to elucidate both past and present. In the 1780s, Thomas Jefferson was appointed to succeed Benjamin Franklin as a US diplomat to France. Following Franklin, Jefferson wrote, "Was an excellent school of humility." Once Jefferson became accustomed to his post, his boss, George Washington, received letters like this from the Marquis de Lafayette. "Mr. Jefferson enjoys universal regard and does the affairs of America to perfection." But Jefferson did not always follow diplomatic protocol, as my colleague Caitlin Lawrence reminded me the other day. In fact, as president, Jefferson radically altered diplomatic norms. I mentioned that elections have consequences. After the lengthy, bitter, and fiercely contested election of 1800, Jefferson sought to revise the canons of etiquette, as he wrote. This is best observed in the so-called Merry Affair of 1803. It's long and involved, it's full of intrigue, but it essentially goes like this. Anthony Merry was King George's ambassador to Washington, and he expected a ceremonial welcome at the president's house that would have been aligned with his experiences at European courts. That meant he arrived to meet Jefferson dressed in full ceremonial regalia. Jefferson, on the other hand, was wearing his favorite slippers and rumpled clothes. Of course, this was deliberate, as was a later slight observed at a dinner at the president's house Merry and his wife were invited to. Also invited to the dinner, the French ambassador, representing the nation the British were just then fighting a major war with. This was an unfathomable breach of etiquette. What was Jefferson signaling? Well, a new world order. One where Jefferson's United States was no longer Britain's colonial possession, but was an independent nation and an equal state. Jefferson hoped his style of diplomacy would ensure American sovereignty and democratize the law of nations. And of course, he was successful in doing so, even though it left some diplomats shaking their heads, muttering under their breath. Jefferson reminded everyone that the ball of liberty rolling around the globe got its start in America. Today, as we begin the 15th annual AAD conference at Monticello in partnership with AAD, UVA Center for Politics, may we all learn from one another so that we can do the affairs of America and the world to perfection. Now it is my distinct honor to introduce Ambassador Ronald E. Newman. Ambassador Newman is the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. He has served 3 times as ambassador to Algeria, Bahrain, and finally to Afghanistan from July 2005 to April 2007. Ambassador Newman is the author of 2 books, 3 Embassies, 4 Wars, a personal memoir from 2017, and The Other War, Winning and Losing in Afghanistan. Please welcome Ambassador Ronald Newman.
Andrew, thank you. Thank you to the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. It's a pleasure. It's hard to believe that 15 years ago we had our first conference, and it was sort of an accident that the late Dr. Rui Ramazani brought us down to talk about a program that we had just, a paper that we had just published. And it grew. It just kept growing. And so we kept thinking of other subjects. Well, we wouldn't be here today without a great deal of help from your side, you, Leslie. I want to particularly note my own staff, Maria Rosales, Sienna Ross, and Kobe Young, without whom very little would get done at the Academy. The Academy is a strange organization, so for many of you who kind of wonder what it is, first of all, it teaches nothing, at least not in a formal way. It's called the Academy because members elect other members, like the Academy of Sciences or something. It's not a teaching institution. It's just over 40 years old, started by luminaries like Henry Kissinger and Ellsworth Bunker. For those of you who study diplomacy, the name George Kennan will still mean something, and he was a founding member of the Academy. We only bring in about 20 members a year. We never elect everybody on the ballot, which keeps it meaningful. It has really two lines of organization or effort. One is to talk to Americans about why diplomacy is important, what the reality of diplomacy is, and thereby engender, hopefully, some support for diplomacy, even funding. And the other line of effort is to work with the Congress, State Department on things we think they could do better. And that's where the Academy is a really unique institution, because when a think tank or a university has published a study, they would be done with the project. In our case, that is sometimes when we go to work on pushing for the implementation of the project. And so we've spent the last couple of years getting a small piece of legislation passed to enable diplomats to take a little more risk and get out of fortified embassies. And we're now heavily engaged in pushing in the Congress for the creation of more training positions and a diplomatic reserve corps. And as horrible as things are in Washington, we may be engaged in that process for some time. So that's the Academy in a nutshell. I think today's subject is very much in line with the kind of thing I was talking about, what is the reality of diplomacy? Because, there's pretty universal consensus that democracy is good, and elections are a part of democracy, and that's good, except when we screw it up, in which case it's not so good. But elections and democracy can produce all kinds of changes, produce changes in America, which diplomats then have to explain, we were over there last week, but we're over here now. It can produce great changes in foreign governments, and then we have to adjust to those changes because their orientation may change, but our interests probably haven't. And then we have the business of electoral missions, which are particularly intrusive sometimes, and which are very much part of what we're about. So each of these pieces that we're going to be talking about today gets into a kind of more detailed look at a part of this subject. But life didn't begin yesterday. And to talk about that, and also because we are at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, and because it has always been part of our tradition here in the 15 years of talks, that we begin with a look back, with a connection. And so we have Dr. Tyson Reeder, who is a historian of early American politics and constitutionalism, who's going to talk to us. He has written a fascinating book, Serpent in Eden, about foreign meddling and partisan politics in James Madison's Washington. And it's really, to me, it's quite fascinating because it shows there's almost nothing new under the sun. That every kind of, the foreigners are meddling. The foreigners are sowing, disinformation. The American politicians are trying to make use of the foreign influence. I mean, we're a little taken up with those themes today, and it's, I think, very useful to have somebody as distinguished as Dr. Tyson Reeder, who is now, I think, at Brigham Young University, but he was, if I remember rightly, he was at the University of Virginia, so there's a little bit of a homecoming here. So with that, please welcome Dr. Tyson Reeder.
Thank you, Ambassador Newman, and thank you to all of you for being here. Thanks to Andrew and the American Academy of Diplomacy and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation in Monticello for hosting this terrific event. Yes, this is a bit of a homecoming for me. I flew in last night, and I've been out at Brigham Young University. I was in a position a year ago where I was faced with one of those good opportunities, or those good moments in life where I have two good options before me, and I chose to go to Brigham Young University, but when I came in this late last night, it felt very much like coming home, and I was fortunate to be able to attend a discussion with University of Virginia students this morning who asked smart and perspicacious questions that I came to expect from students at the University of Virginia. So it's been wonderful to be back here. For today's discussion, I want us to begin at a time when it seemed that American democracy teetered on crisis. The sitting U.S. president had misused public funds to obtain potentially incriminating information about his political opposition. He had no hard evidence of criminal conduct, but he and his Secretary of State subscribed to conspiracy theories that foreign actors had held legal dirt he could use against the opposing party. To get his hands on the information, the president worked with shadow diplomats who had close contacts to a foreign government. Knowing that his maneuvers would stir controversy, he tried to conceal his actions from Congress and the public, but word leaked out. When his political opponents learned what he had done, they stormed the media to warn the public that the president was colluding with a foreign enemy. They accused him of endangering national security for his own political benefit during an election year. The president was James Madison. The year was 1812. During the first decades of the early republic, Americans believed that they needed to unite against foreign danger, but they disagreed about which nation or empire presented that danger. While Britain and France warred against each other, Americans split into a two-party system between Federalists, who wanted close commercial ties with Britain, and Republicans who sympathized with France and its revolution. Mistrust led each side to accuse the other of foreign collusion. Partisans often indulged in the very behavior they denounced, colluding with foreign actors to repel the purported collusion between their foreign and domestic foes. The nation spiraled into a destructive symbiosis between foreign meddling and partisan politics. Through it all, nobody claimed a more central role than James Madison. As a leading delegate at the Constitutional Convention, Republican congressional leader, Secretary of State, and finally President, Madison grappled with foreign meddling for over 3 decades. At the same time, he emerged as a party leader, feeding the partisanship that bred foreign intrigues. So, his career embodies this calamitous cycle of foreign intervention and partisan politics that culminated, in this case, in the War of 1812. Now, for today's discussion, I want us to explore the bookends of Madison's national political career, spending most of our time examining foreign meddling in his constitutional thought of the 1780s, and then fast-forwarding to the months prior to the War of 1812, considering Madison's own complicated tussle with foreign meddling and its implications for early America. When France joined American patriots and declared war against Britain in 1778, Americans' colonial rebellion became a world war. For France and Spain, the ramifications transcended. They went beyond American independence. They had bigger fish to fry. They wanted to rewrite imperial maps in America, the Caribbean, Europe, the Mediterranean, and Asia. The French foreign minister, Comte de Vergennes, viewed the United States as a minor player on a large international stage. To defeat the British, he needed his longtime Spanish allies more than he needed upstart American revolutionaries. Vergennes wanted to hurt the British more than he wanted to help the United States. He hoped to keep the new nation as a French pawn against Britain in North America, not unleash it to expand across the continent. Many Americans feared that their allies would prove as troublesome as their enemies in the future. Britain allied with Native Americans. France fought Britain. Spain sided with France. Native Americans aided Spain. All seemed to threaten the United States. With the aid of their dubious French and Spanish allies, Americans eked out victory in the war and secured a flattering peace treaty. The image here is, of course, of Yorktown and the American victory at Yorktown, the joint French and American victory, I should say. Far from making a grand debut on the world stage, the United States barely managed a timid entrance. Languishing with internal divisions and a frail government, the Republic lay exposed to hostile enemies and slightly less hostile allies. With the war over, foreign powers awaited the day when the Union would collapse and they could seize the pieces. Madison worried that day would arrive sooner than later, given the weakness of the U.S. governing charter, the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation bound the states as a shaky alliance rather than a single nation. Congress possessed limited powers to wage war and conduct diplomacy, but little else. Deprived of the power to exact taxes, regulate foreign or domestic commerce, or effectively recruit soldiers, Congress remained but a diplomatic assembly, as John Adams put it. Without a more united government, the United States might fall to foreign rapacity. Few Americans felt that alarm as keenly as Madison. On March 13, 1787, Congressman Madison strode by New York's Bowling Green, pictured here, on Broadway with his colleague William Bingham, and the pair approached the lavish two-story mansion of the Spanish diplomat Diego de Gardoqui. Since 1785, Gardoqui had tried to use Americans' divisions against them to protect Spain's exclusive control of the Mississippi River, the most important commercial highway in the West. Gardoqui felt that he could persuade Northerners to abandon U.S. calls for access to the Mississippi if, in return, he promised enticing trade benefits with Spain. The maneuver threatened Madison's hope that Americans would populate the West and use the river to export their agricultural goods, something he considered vital to the very existence of the Republic. With other Easterners, Madison worried that Westerners would lend their allegiance to whichever nation could guarantee their access to the Mississippi. By 1787, Madison was convinced that Gardoqui intended to divide the East and the West and pit the North against the South. Even worse for Madison, if Northerners sacrificed the river to Spain, Westerners just might court Britain and British Canada to protect what he called their betrayed rights. To Madison, access to the Mississippi was not just a commercial benefit, it was a national security necessity. So, Madison approached Gardoqui's mansion that March in a last-ditch effort to get Spain to allow U.S. access to the Mississippi. But Gardoqui didn't budge. Before Madison left Gardoqui's residence, the Spaniard taunted him, saying that Westerners would make good Spanish subjects. Madison wondered if he was joking. and he wasn't, not entirely. About 5 months before Madison's ill-fated meeting with Gardoqui, Congressman James White of Western North Carolina had called on Gardoqui in the same mansion. Conceding that Spain would never grant Americans access to the Mississippi, White predicted that his constituents would feel abandoned by the U.S. Confederacy and Spain could win their loyalty. The possibility of Western independence intrigued Gardoqui. If Westerners declared independence and allied or united with Spain, Gardoqui's government would enjoy a buffer zone between their richer dominions of Mexico and the Louisiana Territory and the encroaching United States. During the meeting with Madison, Gardoqui withheld most of the details about the encounter with White. He intimated only that some person connected with the Western country had proposed the idea of Americans as Spanish subjects. Certainly, he meant the intelligence as a soft threat. If Americans could not control their land-grabbing Westerners, then Spain just might turn them against the Republic. With Gardoqui's threat spinning in his mind, Madison lamented that the intemperance of party had betrayed America to foreign interference. With that awareness, he set out to cure what he called the mortal diseases of the existing Constitution, meaning the Articles of Confederation. As the 1787 Constitutional Convention approached, Madison shut himself in his New York boarding room to organize his ideas. A year earlier, he had plunged into history, making a systematic list of past confederacies, their constitutions, characteristics, strengths, defects. According to his studies, the Swiss Confederacy, or the Helvetic Confederacy as he calls it here, had divided into Protestant and Catholic cantons, and each bloc allied with opposing foreign powers. Internal religious wars bloodied German states during the 1600s until the Peace of Westphalia allowed foreign nations to dictate a new German constitution. Foreign ministers usurped Belgian sovereignty by fomenting disunion among its provinces. Romans seduced members of the Achaean League, and Macedonians fostered dissensions among them. History abounded with examples of mighty powers inciting internal divisions to manipulate confederacies. But one confederacy in particular hounded Madison: Greece, particularly the Amphictyonic League, or the Amphictyonic Confederacy. Greece's sacred war began as a religious dispute between the Phocians and Amphictyons, but expanded to the entire peninsula. The Amphictyons recruited the assistance of Philip of Macedonia, who fomented the divisions, acquired a seat in their council, and eventually overran Greek sovereignty. Madison concluded that if Greece had strengthened its union, she would never have yielded to Macedon. Madison sounded the alarm to his colleagues. He warned Washington that foreign nations might imitate Philip and exploit American divisions to exacerbate disunity. He reminded Jefferson that the United States stood in danger of having the same game played on our Confederacy by which Philip managed that of the Grecian state. Madison fretted that some Americans would serve only too well as what he called fit instruments of foreign machinations. To Madison, Americans needed to embrace diverse opinions without allowing foreign powers to exploit their divisions. In his New York boarding room, he recorded his solution. If Americans wanted to avoid foreign nations picking off their sovereignty bit by bit, they needed to unify under a stronger national government. He faced a Herculean task trying to convince others. In the weeks before delegates descended on Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, Gardoqui met secretly with some of them, and they confided their doubts that they could reach any agreement. They confessed that it could take years to contrive a new constitution because of the disunity of spirits that prevailed. Americans could call themselves a confederation all they wanted, Gardoqui jeered, but there is no confederation. Meanwhile, Madison hoped to turn the Confederation into a nation. A few months after his failed meeting with Gardoqui, Madison warned his colleagues at the Constitutional Convention about what he called the influence of foreign powers in U.S. politics. In every major debate, from representation in Congress to selecting the president, Madison considered the extent to which proposed measures would invite or repel foreign meddling. When the delegates signed their handiwork on September 17th, happy Constitution Day, a couple of days ago, everybody, Madison hoped that they had granted the government the proper stability and energy. Well, Gardoqui doubted it. As far as Gardoqui could see, the Constitution likely would hasten American destruction. By its own terms, the Constitution required 9 states to ratify it before it became operative, and Americans split into broad factions for and against the charter. Gardoqui delighted in what he called the disgust over the new government, which, if not adopted, may result in confusion or, what is better, in 2 confederations. The minister knew that many Westerners feared that a distant national government would ignore their pleas for the Mississippi. Gardoqui insisted to his superiors that Spain should never cede the Mississippi because on it, he told his superiors at Madrid, depends the union of the states. So long as the Spanish held the Mississippi, they could divide Westerners against the East. If, however, the United States unites as it grows, Gardoqui warned Madrid, it would become a fearsome nation. Madison, of course, hoped for exactly that. In mid-November 1787, Alexander Hamilton, seated there with the circle around him, as you can see, recruited Madison to help convince New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution. Before approaching Madison, Hamilton and John Jay had churned out several essays and splashed them into New York newspapers as the Federalist. Although Jay had addressed foreign intervention and Hamilton had discussed internal divisions, neither resolved what Madison saw as the fundamental problem. Foreign powers might intentionally promote internal divisions to perpetuate anarchy and weakness. With his first essay, the 10th in the series, Madison lifted the Federalist from an influential defense of the Constitution to a timeless piece of political theory. Governments could not extinguish political factions without extinguishing liberty, he theorized. But perhaps they could control the worst tendencies of factions. He articulated his unconventional theory that many parties would compete for power in a large national republic, prohibiting the rise of an oppressive majority. Americans could live peaceably not because they respected each other's opinions, but because no single faction could control political power. If liberty inflamed factions, the government needed to ensure that foreign agents could not exploit that factionalism to rend the nation. Madison found the solution to that problem in increased federal power. In the following essay, he argued that states that bordered foreign nations needed the strength and resources of the Union as a bulwark against foreign danger. In his next 3 essays, Madison taught Americans what he had learned from his long study of ancient confederacies, ticking off all of the examples that he had been repeating to anyone who would listen over the past year. Madison's message resounded: strengthen the central government or let foreign powers exploit internal divisions to usurp U.S. sovereignty. The Constitution harmonized, at least Madison hoped, his ambitious vision of a politically diverse nation with a strong central government that would protect liberty without succumbing to foreign meddling. But Gardoqui hadn't given up. For months, Gardoqui had groomed his friendship with John Brown, the congressman who represented Virginia's Kentucky region. In July 1788, Congress had denied Kentucky statehood, and Gardoqui sensed that Brown's fury at that decision made him vulnerable to manipulation. After what Gardoqui called artfully insinuating that Kentuckians would enjoy Spanish support if they split from the Union, Gardoqui hosted Brown at, where else, his mansion. A lot of shady discussions happened at this mansion to talk details. Incidentally, I'm sure that some of our ambassadors here have artfully insinuated in the past. Brown promised Gardoqui that he would soon return to Kentucky, advocate the plan of secession, and keep the Spaniard apprised of developments. Then Madison intervened. Brown and Madison boarded the same Manhattan house, and Brown confided to Madison his meetings with Gardoqui. Madison convinced him to stop reporting Gardoqui's overtures to Kentuckians. After Brown went home, he wrote to Madison to say that he had still not decided what to do about Gardoqui's proposal. Madison shot off a reply warning Brown of the political calamity that would result from the hazardous plan. He reassured the Kentuckian that Congress would never forsake Westerners in their fight for the Mississippi. To Gardoqui's chagrin, Madison convinced Brown to abandon the idea. The Spaniard would have to look elsewhere for Americans to carry out his plans. By February 1789, other potential separatists followed Brown's suit, placing their bets on the new U.S. government rather than on Spain. That same month, the citizens of Madison's district voted to send him to New York as a member of the House of Representatives in the first Congress of the new government. As Madison rode to New York, he pondered the looming contentions, first between federal and anti-federal parties, and then between northern and southern parties. Those divisions would soon test whether he and his fellow framers had constructed a nation that would accommodate political conflict and yet repel foreign danger. Had they succeeded? It's a cliffhanger. To answer that question, let's fast forward to late 1811. Decades have passed since the ratification of the Constitution. Revolutionary France had declared war on Britain in 1793, beginning hostilities that would last 2 decades and split Americans between Federalists who sympathized with Britain and Republicans such as Madison who favored France. The parties remained fluid, ill-defined, and nowhere near as organized as modern political parties. Even so, their adherents demanded loyalty from each other, and the parties provided a platform for opposition politics. Madison became a Republican opposition leader, together, of course, with Thomas Jefferson, against the Federalists. Then he helped engineer Jefferson's election and the Revolution of 1800 when Republicans leapt into power. He served as Jefferson's Secretary of State and was elected president in 1808. Conflicts with Britain had been heating up for a long time, and Republicans were inching closer to declaring war. Madison would be standing for re-election within a year. He had spent over 2 decades accusing Federalists of colluding with Britain to undermine democracy and battling counter-accusations that he and his Republicans colluded with France. We can get an idea of some of the accusations flung around over the preceding decades by viewing a few pieces of propaganda. This image shows a group of unsavory-looking Republicans, or anti-Federalists, cozied with the notorious French diplomat Edmond Charles Genet, who holds a plan for the entire subversion of the government. This image depicts the American Union, overseen by Providence, prevent Jefferson from sacrificing the Constitution and independence of the United States to the altar of Gallic or French despotism. The altar is surrounded by bundles of money depicting France's corrupt means of acquiring wealth, and of course the devil leers in the corner. In this image, Napoleon promises Jefferson that he will make him king over the United States in return for implementing the infamous embargo of 1807, as Jefferson tries to justify the measure to discontented Americans. Petitions from suffering states lay on Jefferson's desk, and a bulldog representing the British caricature John Bull, as it's written in the collar, if you could see that more clearly, notices Napoleon and tries in vain to warn the Americans in the room. Finally, this image shows Madison flanked by Napoleon and the devil, pleading for their help as his political fortunes crater. So, how do we get to the point in Madison's career where the man who helped craft the Constitution to avert the cycle of foreign meddling and internal division is accused of soliciting foreign aid in his political fortunes? Well, for the long answer, you'll need to read the book. That'll be my one plug. But for now, we can eavesdrop on a chance nighttime meeting on a ship crossing the Atlantic in late 1811. Paul-Émile Soubirous wandered the deck of the New Galen late at night, lost in self-pity. Years of shady escapades had caught up with this unsavory French con artist, and Napoleon Bonaparte's police had finally chased him out of Europe. After fleeing to England, he had boarded the New Galen for Boston in November. On the ship, he masqueraded as the fictitious Count Edouard de Crillon and schemed for a way to return to Napoleon's good graces. While he strolled through the night air, he encountered John Henry, another dejected traveler. As the pair talked in the darkness, Henry confided his distress to Soubirous. 2 years earlier, Governor General James Craig of British Canada had employed Henry as a secret agent in America. Henry's mission was to determine if Federalists might sever their stronghold of New England from the United States. Henry felt slighted when he received a paltry compensation. The former spy traveled to Britain to seek a more substantial sum, or at least some sort of government post in compensation for his services, but he failed. Embittered and impoverished, he boarded the New Galen for his return to America. On the ship, Henry told Soubirous about documents he had retained from his secret mission. Still acting as Crillon, the con artist proposed that they cooperate with the French government to sell the papers to the Madison administration. Henry could exact revenge on the British, Soubirous could impress French officials, and they both could swindle a profit off the US government. Once in the United States, they related their plan to the French minister in Washington, Louis Serrurier. All the while, Soubirous is still acting as Comte de Crillon. The minister cautiously favored the scheme in hope that it would alert Madison to Governor Craig's intrigues and push the United States closer to war with Britain. Careful not to dirty his own hands, he used Soubirous as a shadow representative. The team convinced Madison and his Secretary of State, James Monroe, that the documents would prove a conspiracy between Federalists and Britain. Sensing his bargaining power, Henry started the price at the astronomical figure of 25,000 pounds sterling, nearly $125,000 at the time. Monroe agreed to the price, but the next day informed Soubirous that the Treasury lacked the funds. That's how much they're asking. They don't even have the money if they wanted it. If they wanted to. Monroe agreed to the price. The president, Monroe said, could pay $50,000, and even to do that, they would need to empty the Secret Service budget, which was the espionage budget at the time. Henry roared that he would rather burn the papers than sell them for such a low price. So, watching the deal start to crash and likely seeing his own chance to profit, Soubirous, determined con artist that he was, noticed this moment, and he intervened with the alarmed Monroe and promised to bring the price down. At 5 o'clock in the morning on February 5th, 1812, Soubirous wrote Monroe good news. Henry was ready to sell. He wanted 18,000 pounds sterling, still about 34,000 pounds more than the United States could afford. To compensate the difference, Soubirán had promised Henry his Spanish estate, San Marcial, and the United States could reimburse Soubirán later for the gift. If you haven't guessed, Soubirán owns no such property, though neither Henry nor Monroe knew that. As a supposed aristocrat, Soubirán couldn't appear to be angling for a portion of the upfront payment, but he had schemed a way to get his cut. Henry would later learn that Soubirán was no count and that he would receive no estate. For the time, though, Soubirán had secured the purchase of the documents. To others, he insisted that he made the offer to finalize the deal and serve his country. Serrurier, the French ambassador, doubted the claim, but he had no interest in arguing with the man who was about to reveal documents that might hurl the United States into war with Britain. He and Monroe witnessed the transfer of the bogus Crillon's forged deed to Henry. Madison had purchased Henry's stash for an enormous amount of public money, $50,000. To put that into perspective, he could have purchased a warship for the same amount for the war that he was planning on waging. To his own embarrassment, Madison learned that although the papers revealed British connivance, they contained no incriminating information about his political opposition. With the papers in their possession, Madison and Monroe began to verify their authenticity, obviously a step a less avid buyer would have taken before making the purchase. The pair learned that they were authentic, but essentially useless. They had just spent $50,000 and promised another $34,000 for papers that revealed no sedition, no plot, no crime, and no names. Madison and Monroe needed to make the most of their blunder, and they began by trying to conceal what they had paid for Henry's stash of documents. When Monroe prepared a bill of exchange for Amsterdam bankers to pay Soubirán his share, a payment that was never made, he left the order vague to conceal its purpose. He directed the U.S. minister in France to take a receipt of payment from somebody other than Crillon and without mentioning Crillon's name. Monroe extracted a cover letter from Henry that, as you might be able to read in the highlighted portions, implied that Henry had given rather than sold his papers to the administration. Henry wrote the letter February 20th, 10 days after he delivered the documents and received payment. Aware that Madison would likely publish his words, Henry promoted the intelligence in the same exaggerated terms that he had pitched it to the administration. By exposing the intrigue of British rulers, the letters would inspire unanimity among all parties in America and melt all division and disunion among its citizens. Despite the bloviating tone, Henry had accurately captured and appraised the nation's dilemma. Foreign powers could insult the United States at will, knowing that the people would never retaliate as one. Madison counted on Henry's earlier promise that the letters would extinguish everything worth the name of opposition to the government. Even if the papers exposed no Federalist conspiracy, they offered proof that Britain wanted to instigate one. The president gambled that they betrayed enough to shame Federalists and unite Americans against Britain. Some of the information would embarrass Federalists, but that embarrassment paled against Madison's folly of blowing his Secret Service fund for trivial intelligence, essentially information that you could have gotten from any U.S. newspaper at the time. And it withered before the irony that Madison paid foreign nationals an unconscionable amount of public money to reveal that his political opposition had not conspired with a foreign power. By 1812, Madison lived in and had helped create a nation in which it seemed rational to trust a former British spy and mysterious French egomaniac more than his political opponents. With the purchase of the Henry documents, Madison epitomized the irony of foreign collusion. Partisans colluded with foreign powers because they feared their opponents colluded with foreign powers. Despite the administration's attempts to conceal the purchase, Federalists found out about it, and they riddled Madison with charges of misconduct for using public money to purchase documents meant to discredit their party in an election year, no less. Rumors flew that Crillon was an intimate friend of Napoleon and chummy with Serrurier. One Federalist theorized that Napoleon would reward Crillon for what he had done for Madison, his viceroy. Rather than proof of a British plot, the documents became, according to one Federalist, proof positive of French influence. Another Federalist mixed biblical metaphors. A Frenchman stole, like the serpent, into Eden upon the slumberers of the garden. Madison countercharged that the British had employed Henry to subvert the U.S. government and dismember the Union. In the following months, Republicans shot resolutions to Madison, berating Britain's depravity and cheering for war. As one group of petitioners put it, "We have seen a serpent in the shape of a spy attempting to sting us in the very heart of our Union." Another used the same imagery. A gloating, civilized British spy is found like the serpent in Eden, beguiling us to our perdition. To bruise the serpent's head, they called for a prompt, vigorous, and open war. Madison and congressional Republicans plunged the nation into hostilities. 2 years into the conflict, British troops left the capital in flames. The fires warned Americans how close they stood to defeat. Americans eked out a draw in the War of 1812, but they celebrated it as a victory. As a surge of national pride gripped the country, few considered how partisan conflict had aided foreign meddling and led to a war that almost shattered the Union. This cartoon demonstrates the disastrous cycle. Washington is in flames while Madison flees to his, quote, bosom friend Napoleon, toting his anti-British and pro-French policies along with his correspondence with Napoleon and Napoleon's instructions. The rub? This is a British cartoon. A foreign enemy trying to convince American partisans that their political opponents were colluding with a foreign enemy. So in answer to Madison's musings about whether the Republic could overcome the destructive cycle of internal division and foreign meddling, he waged the very war that almost proved it could not. In his final years, Madison penned a memorandum entitled Advice to My Country, which remained unread until after his death in 1836. "The advice nearest to my heart," he wrote, "and deepest in my convictions, is that the union of the states be cherished and perpetuated. Let the open enemy to it be regarded as a Pandora with her box opened, and the disguised one as the serpent, creeping with his deadly wiles into paradise." Madison died unsure but hopeful about the fate of his country. Unable to escape the vices of a partisan-riven age, he summoned the very specters he feared, feeding the division that encouraged foreign meddling. Through the decades, though, he aspired to protect a vulnerable democracy and sustain a strong nation. Madison's fears and vices persist, but so does his hope. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions, which I think we left time for, right? Terrific.
Hello. So this whole affair, did it kind of lead to the War of 1812, or do you think it would have happened anyway had there been no influence or like discovery of the Henry as a spy?
So I guess the question is, was Henry dispositive to this whole thing, right? No, I don't think he was. What I do think is that, should I still be talking? Sorry, excuse me, sorry. So again, the question is, was Henry dispositive to the War of 1812, right? And I don't think that he was necessarily, but this cycle was, and the Henry documents, we might call them, are a sort of culmination of a cycle that has been happening since the early 1790s. I mean, almost the moment the new government is instituted under the Constitution. So is any one episode dispositive? Well, probably not. But the continual snowballing of each episode does lead to the War of 1812. Yeah. Thank you.
Was there any, to your knowledge, after the fact, learning on behalf of Madison or others kind of in future kind of election cycles as to the dangers of election meddling and foreign influences?
Are you saying, like, did they kind of learn their lessons
In
from
a way,
the
sort of, did they
past?
kind of understand that that was happening? And kind of, was there kind of any reflection upon that by anybody either in that administration or anything subsequent?
Yes. So, were they aware of the problem? Yes, they were aware of the problem, and they frequently commented on the problem, and yet the problem persists, largely, I think, for the same reasons that we're aware of the problem, and yet the problem persists, right? So you can be introspective about it. The question becomes, who do you blame for it? And that's part of this destructive cycle, right? And so as long as we have partisanship, there will be other people to blame for it. And Madison, I want to just reiterate, was not saying that we should not have partisanship. He wasn't saying that. In fact, he said that if you do not have parties, all that you're signaling is that you have somehow snuffed out liberty. They go hand in hand. So the question that Madison was trying to answer, and I think that we're still trying to answer today, is how do you have intense political division without succumbing to foreign meddling? And I think we're still trying to answer that question.
There's an old trope in historiography that war hawks in Congress really fed into the whole move for the War of 1812. Was this an awareness on the part of the president, and was this partisanship in Congress manipulated to achieve a push for war?
Yeah, so certainly war hawks, when we talk about war hawks, we're talking about usually Republicans who really are pushing for a war with Britain, really dating into the early 1800s, right? So the relationship is complicated between Madison and war hawks. Sometimes Madison is reluctant to go to war, and he's being pushed into war with war hawks. Other times, especially beginning in late 1811, Madison starts to rev up for war and sort of start to drum for war, and he gets frustrated with Congress for not being swift enough to become war ready, for example. So his relationship with war hawks is a little bit tenuous, but they all tend to be Republicans. So they're kind of on the same team, if you will. So certainly war hawks made more of the Henry episode than was probably necessary. The Henry episode, I think, it clearly does show Britain is trying to instigate these divisions in America. I mean, it's clearly foreign meddling in ways that I think the United States would have been, was entirely justified in protesting. The question is, did it deserve the attention it received at the time? And I think that was a lot of political posturing by war hawks and others.
So just kind of briefly, how did this actually end up playing out in the election campaign of 1812? Was this, I mean, obviously Madison was reelected, but was this a significant issue for him? How did he respond to it?
Yeah. So if you're familiar with the way elections worked, especially at the time, we don't have. I mean, they're starting to transition to ideas of popular votes combined with the Electoral College, right? But Massachusetts is a major player here. It's a very federalist state, but it actually has a Republican governor. And the idea that's floated is that the Henry episode, Madison is trying to leverage the Henry episode and use these documents, especially to flip Massachusetts, to flip its state legislature so that its state legislature will choose, will select Republican electors. So yes, these accusations are floated about. There are Republicans who, including Madison, they never come out and say, we don't care what these documents say. We're going to use them to fight against Federalists anyway. The whole reason we wanted these documents, we don't care so much about Britain. What we really wanted to do was hurt Federalists. They don't say that per se out loud to one another, but sometimes you get hints of that. I mean, you get people who are writing back and forth, and they say, well, yeah, there's not a lot in there that hurts Federalists, but we're sure that something was happening with Federalists. And maybe I'm going a little far afield of your question. I'll come back if I don't completely answer it. But what I think is important to highlight is I don't think that Madison has corrupt ambition when he's trying to procure these documents. I really don't. I think that Madison lives in a nation where it truly does make more sense to trust these shady characters than it does to trust his political opponents. I'm not saying that Federalists are untrustworthy. I'm saying that that's just the world that Madison lived in. It seemed sensible to him. And so that's different than having some sort of corrupt motive for this. But yes, it does play out. I mean, Madison is in the end reelected, but it is a conversation. It's a part of the conversation of the election for the entire election year.